right. Hello, everyone. It's Dr. Stephen Freiberg here, aka the Dad Anesthesiologist, doing another physician father interview. Super excited today. I get to speak with Dr. Michael Grant. Dr. Grant is an associate professor of anesthesiology at the Johns Hopkins Hospital. He's an anesthesiologist intensivist and is also the director of the Enhanced Recovery After Surgery program there, amongst many other titles that he holds that he feels need not even be mentioned, but I'm always very impressed. And was super excited to speak with Dr. Grant today. He was always very much a role model and a mentor of mine. I admire him so much, not just for his ability in the clinical realm, but for his role as a dad and as a mentor and an educator. So Dr. Grant, thanks so much for speaking with me today.
It's my pleasure, Steve, as always. It's good to see you again.
Absolutely. So we'll jump right in. Tell us a little bit about your medical journey or your journey in medical training. I know it wasn't the most straightforward path, and then I know you've entered in a lot of really interesting areas now. So tell us about the journey and what your practice looks like today.
Yeah, so I've been lucky because I've been able to make decisions quick enough to go more or less straight through. But you're right, the actual decision making was a little more circuitous than that. I went to college a little bit on a lark. I was a bit of a late bloomer in that respect, but eventually made the decision to come at least towards the medicine side of things. I was very, very late to actually take most of my entrance exams. In fact, I'm one of these guys that took the LSAT, the MCAT, the GMAT, the GRE, all kind of at the same time, and then took a look to see what would stick. Ultimately stumbled into medicine. And during the course of my time in medical school, there was, I think, like many people, a lot of different options that I thought were potentially compelling. And I'll say that I was much more interested in things like cardiac surgery or interventional cardiology, some of that high octane kind of stuff. And I think it took me a little bit of time to realize that much of the itch that I wanted to scratch could be done so through anesthesiology. So, I didn't stray too far from that. I do most of my gig now is in cardiac anesthesia, and then I work in the CV-SICU the majority of my clinical time. So I didn't stray too far from that boundary, but I certainly didn't set out with the expectation that anesthesiology and even furthermore critical care was going to be my landing point. So it's been a lot of fun. I'm excited to have come. My training initially was at University of Maryland. I've come across town to Johns Hopkins. I've loved every step along the way. So not a big bendy, windy road, but not a straight shot either.
And what was it that ultimately made you decide upon anesthesia and then later cardiac anesthesia and critical care? I know you mentioned interest in heart-related stuff, but you took one of many potential paths to get there. And I'm curious about what was it that drove you specifically to this one?
Yeah, I think the reason that I was so interested in those other disciplines within this field was a little bit around the physiology. I think it's a pretty compelling area of practice. I like the ins and outs of understanding hemodynamics, and I like the ins and outs of understanding some of the structural issues with the heart. And I think that from a global perspective, it's pretty hard to find something that affects more people in the world than heart disease. So I felt like there was an impact to be made. I will say that I was not well exposed to what existed within the world of anesthesiology in general. And I certainly was not aware that anesthesiologists could have as much specialization as we're able to have. And I think part of the reason that it was a bit of a late route to this ultimate conclusion was because, I don't think medical infrastructure is set up, certainly not education is set up for you to get the kind of exposure that, I ultimately was lucky enough to have. The backstory is that I went in intending to be a cardiac surgeon and walked into a room during a sub-I and realized that the anesthesiologists arguably had more impact over what was happening in that procedure than the surgeon might have.
You don't tell
that's not, right? Say that again.
You don't tell the surgeons that though.
No, well, we make it a point to let them understand how little an impact they can possibly have anytime we get that chance. But I think for me it was a bit of an eye-opening experience. The fact that we can have our hands on echocardiography, the fact that we can pull the strings from a cardio, physiology standpoint, the fact that we have such an impact in the ICU, those things I became aware of those things, and that was really compelling to me. So, I really like the idea of having some of the benefits of being an anesthesiologist, which are that you have fairly predictable on and off time. I think that you can partition your time in a very specific way. And, I think we'll get to some of this, but it's helpful from a family dynamic standpoint. And yet when you're in it, you can have the same level of intensity and procedural aspects that you could have yearned for in other disciplines. So for me, it really wasn't, it didn't take a lot of convincing.
And what about to pursue critical care?
Yeah, so I had a sense all along that I was going to do something in the area of cardiac, and so cardiac anesthesiology was something I felt pretty clear on. But I realized that in order for me to be able again to partition my time and be able to have some of the flexibility I envisioned in my life, I would probably need another area to practice. And critical care was also compelling because I think there's a really wonderful footprint. I think anesthesiologists have an amazing amount of impact there. But I also got the sense that if I was going to do any one thing too often, it might feel a little stale after a while. I tend to be somebody who likes to have a little bit of an unusual schedule. I like to dabble in a lot of things all at once, and being able to have a couple of disciplines to work within, I saw it as an opportunity to increase my flexibility. So critical care was another obvious choice for me.
Sure. And then I know you pursued even additional training outside of sort of the traditional clinical fellowships. Tell us about some of that additional training you were doing. As I recall, some of it was while you were still a fellow, and I think a little bit of it extended a little beyond that. But tell us more about that.
Yeah. So I think we get really great training, obviously, from a clinical standpoint. The fellowships are purposefully clinical fellowships, but some of the areas where I still felt a little bit weak were, how does this fit into the macroscopic landscape of perioperative care? How does this stuff, how do you develop skill sets that can make you either marketable eventually from an administrative standpoint, or influence the way that you investigate questions. I do some research on the side, of course, as well, and I felt like I was a little lean in some of these areas. So I went back and pursued some graduate training in something called systems engineering. It's an engineering degree, but it's also a management degree. And it was an opportunity to kind of understand how complex systems can be designed and then implemented. And, I envision this to really inform the way that I think about perioperative care, but also help to put together some of the programs that we devise at Johns Hopkins for taking care of patients. Ultimately, I see this informing a lot more, certainly beyond just perioperative care, can certainly help with some administrative roles down the line if that's something I might find interesting. Again, I've said flexibility a couple of times. Most of the decisions I've made are in essence to increase my flexibility down the line. And when you're young and otherwise able, you might as well try to get as much of that done as possible.
Sure. Very interesting. Well, since you don't have enough on your plate at work, tell us about your dad life.
Yeah, so I'm a really, really lucky man. I'm married to a woman named Tori. We've been married now for just over 10 years, and we have 3 daughters together. We have Bryn, my oldest, who is going to be turning 7 soon, which I can't even believe. My middle one is Bianca. She's just turned 4, and then my youngest is Bonnie. So we have the 3 Bs. The youngest is Bonnie, and she just turned 2. So it's an exciting time in our house. 3 girls. I never thought I'd be the dad to girls, but it's a busy primary responsibility.
Sure. And one of the things that I talk about pretty frequently with guests on the show, and I would argue there's no better person to speak to than you. How do you manage it all? I would say in my interactions with you, you always seem to be one of the most efficient people I knew, who would be like, yeah, I got to pick my girls up, but it's only after I finish my 18 holes and this meta-analysis just got published. And I was like, well, I had breakfast. So just how do you do it all? How do you manage it all?
Yeah, I don't know that there's a great answer to this question, but I can tell you that that the decisions that I make are incredibly intentional. And if I've devoted some time to something, then it's very purposeful, and I see value in it, but I also believe that there's value in cultivating whatever it is that I'm doing. So I guess the easiest way to say this is that, I'm efficient, but I'm efficient in the things that I find to be incredibly valuable things. So, I want to be able to have my time very specifically partitioned in a way that allows me to have access to my family ad lib, that allows me to also feel like I can, be able to devise the skill sets that are necessary to do well in my job, to be able to have the people who I work with, whether they be residents or, whomever at work, can have access to me. And one of the things that I've always found incredibly valuable about any of the people who have mentored me is there's this perception of accessibility that's, I think, really important. And the reality is that anybody, not just me, anybody is always juggling a lot of these responsibilities. But I think the notion that you can be accessible is incredibly, incredibly important. And so I guess the short answer is I don't spend an awful lot of time tinkering with things that I don't find incredibly valuable. And a lot of this is because I've, we can get to some of this, I'm sure, but I've been very lucky that I'm married to a woman who's an incredibly strong woman who I think, carries the brunt of most of the responsibilities in our lives. But also because the things that I choose to do are of incredible value to me. And I make sure that people know that that's the case.
Fair enough. And I mean, this might go a little bit to the point of what you said about accessibility, but not only are you, a crack shot clinician, I will still text you questions more frequently than I'm proud to admit. But even beyond that, I think you're one of the best interpersonal players that I've ever worked with, in that you've got this unique ability to be very accessible and down to earth and really not make a big deal about the things that don't matter, but also simultaneously are very impactful when you need to be. And what do you think it is that makes you so, I guess, effective interpersonally with the people you work with the residents you mentor, et cetera?
Yeah, again, I think this is a really tough question. And by the way, thank you very much. That's a very kind set of things to say. But, I sometimes I think it boils down to the idea that, a lot of the interactions that you have with people, I think, should genuinely come from a place of earnest interest in what it is that they want. That sounds like oversimplifying it, but if you have an idea of what it is the person that you're engaging with wants out of that engagement, every time you're engaging with that person, you really can pretty much accomplish anything you're interested in. And some of this is going to sound like salesmanship, but it's really not. It's if you're working with a resident, you have to have a real understanding of what their incentives are. You have to, if interacting with a nurse, or obviously if you're at home with your loved ones or you're interacting with your kids, I mean, you have to know what it is that they really want out of that moment with you, and you have to give it to them. And I think oftentimes what we sometimes forget is that all of this is about personal reactions, interactions, and understanding what it is that that person's needing from you in that moment, or even just wanting in that moment, and then giving it to them. And so I spend a lot of, I got done telling you that I feel like most of what I do is intentional. And I think this is exactly that, is that I intend in the interactions I have with somebody to either facilitate them getting what they want, or if I really want to be the opposite, I can withhold that from them, I think. And so some of this is just kind of spending a lot of time thinking about what that is.
I think an emerging theme of folks I've spoken to is intentionality, both in time management and a lot of aspects of their lives. And the other thing I think you've said to me before, and I'm sure I'm going to butcher how I remember it, but it has helped me in however it is that I remember it, is that you can't impose your value system onto someone else. And you have to respect another person's value system. And it doesn't mean it's better or worse. It's just different. And that helps, I think, create reasonable expectations between people. Am I kind of remembering that correctly? Or?
No, I thought that was really well said. I mean, obviously you spend most of your days working with people who don't see things the way that you see them. And I think there are two approaches to doing that. One is to try to spend all of your time convincing them that your approach is quote unquote correct, or to recognize that there's going to be something about what they're motivated by that you either don't understand, can't completely emulate, or you just may never agree. And I think you get around a lot of this by respecting that that's just the reality of it. And I think if you spend all your time trying to convince people of your reality, you're going to be a pretty unhappy person when it's all said and done.
Right. No, that makes sense. And so to switch gears a little bit, certainly spend enough time in clinical medicine. What's your favorite part of being a doctor?
Yeah, I like this question. I'll tell you the selfish answer is that I like the intensity of it. I have to be honest that I gravitate to the really challenging cases, and I gravitate to the quite sick, ill patients. I find myself somewhat phasing out a little bit when I feel like there's not a lot of complexity to what it is I'm getting ready to do. But I'll admit that that's not something that can be sustained. So, I like this combination of having some of those elements where you can really scratch that itch, but then also have these relatively modest long-term engagements with patients and their families. And I think one of the reasons I really like ICU is because I can have a day or two of frank intensity in the operating room, but then step into the ICU and feel like I have smoldering intensity, but that intensity really engenders a relationship with the patient over time. So, a little bit of this is selfish because I like the blood and I like the anger and I like the intensity of the room, but I also don't want to live that every minute of every day, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And so I'm sure it might be a different sort of intensity that occurs at home, but what's your favorite part of being a dad? And if it's only the intensity thing, I don't know how much we're going to get out of this, but
Yeah, you got the right. Yeah. There's so many ways to answer this question, but I think the thing that I've landed on is, something happens in your children when you're interacting with them and they just kind of get it, so, there's this exploration phase, then they kind of knock around a little bit and pretend like they're independent. And then all of a sudden they kind of just wake up one day, and so it's different ages for different kids, but there's something really amazing about watching them work on something and then kind of achieve what it is they were trying to do, or come to a recognition of what it is you tried to teach them, or have a success in some small way. Like, for example, my 4-year-old had the hardest time being able to dress herself and then has now been able to achieve it. And you got to see how incredible a smile she has when she's able to just simply put her shirt on. And
right.
that seems like a very small thing, but you can feel that kind of energy from them that you yourself feel when you've done something like that. And it's fun to watch. I have 3 kids, of course, and it's fun to watch each one of them having done that at various stages over the course of their lives. And to think that I've played some part in that, I think, is also really nice to know.
Sure. And given that, let me switch gears a little bit. What do you think is one of the biggest challenges in medicine today?
So in medicine writ large, I think from an, you could probably take this from a couple of different perspectives, but let's say from an individual basis, I think what's really challenging about medicine is understanding what kind of impact you yourself can possibly have. I think one of the reasons that's challenging is because there's so much stuff that's thrown at you that is a little bit beyond your control. There's an awful lot that goes into the care of an individual patient that is no longer as individualized as it used to be. I think one of the things that's changing about medicine is it's no longer that you're the surgeon, they came to see you, you fix their problem, and then that's it. It's that, yeah, you were a surgeon, you were a part of that care, but by the way, there were hundreds of other people who made an impact over the course of that service line. And the reason that that's an important distinction is that it used to be that you could become a physician and just from an individual interaction with patients feel like you got everything you needed out of that. But it's increasingly more common that you don't really understand where your value is added to the enterprise, and that it can be a bit disenfranchising for you to put a lot of effort into your job every day and then feel like you maybe didn't have an impact or don't know how to recognize that impact. And I think that's a big challenge. And I don't think medicine has good answers for this because our values are still a little bit stuck in the old days where it was a very individualized enterprise. I think, we haven't figured out how to modify that to fit the realities of medicine today.
So what would your advice be for young clinicians or any clinician to find value and find meaning in sort of that changing landscape?
Yeah, I think it's tough, and again, some of this is a little bit individualized. But I don't tend to walk into work hoping that I myself will derive or prove my own worth out of the interactions that day. I engender a lot of my personal identity in the success of the entire service line that I work for. So, if we had a series of, successful operations and those patients had good outcomes, I get really, really excited about the process generally, the system-based process that we put together.
Mm.
But similarly, I also find it personally dissatisfying when there's a bad outcome, even if I may not have directly interacted with that patient.
Sure.
And a lot of this comes from this perspective that I mentioned up front, which was that, I think in today's medicine, you have to start thinking about things from a much more systems-based standpoint. And that if you're going into it for just personal gratification, this might not be the best area of practice in today's world. And I don't think that you're going to get the kind of juice that you're expecting, given the squeeze that's necessary.
Right. And so if your daughters came to you in a few years, a variety of years for each one, and said, hey, either as they're in college or going into college or high school, thinking about careers, and said, Dad, I think I want to be a doctor, what would your response to them be?
Yeah, I've thought about this one a lot, and I have to say that I think there's a couple of advantages of going into medicine that I think we all understand. It tends to be that if you can make it through medicine, you're going to have a job. It tends to be that you're also going to be doing quite well financially. It tends to be that you can support your family and your lifestyle. It tends to be a relatively predictable overall road. Obviously some of the downsides are some of the things I described before, which is, I think increasingly more dissatisfied, a profession. I think increasingly a sense of there's a change in the way people practice that didn't used to exist. This is all me contextualizing why. What I would say is I think it really depends on which kid we're talking about and who they are at the time. Because I think there are some, just like any people, who gravitate to this challenge and think that it's absolutely worthwhile and it's going to add value to your life and you're ready. And I also think that for each one of those people, there are probably a host of other people who, as much as they may be talented and proficient and able-bodied, it doesn't necessarily mean that it translates into a meaningful career. The only thing that I've probably learned, I shouldn't even say that I've actually learned this. I'm hoping to learn one day that I can't make decisions for my kids. And, the idea that they may choose a profession, I think, is one that scares me a little bit because, I went through this process myself. And I think anybody's natural inclination as a parent is to try to protect their kids from either making mistakes or taking a more circuitous route to something or not. I've lived my life. Why can't they just live through what I've done to try to get someplace quicker? Everybody has that impulse. So I guess the short answer to your question is, I think if they came to me and said, hey, I'd be interested in doing this, I'd say, okay, let's give it a shot, and, I think like anything, we'll just try to shepherd them through it.
Fair enough. And so then that's one of the challenges we'll inevitably face. Currently, what do you think is one of the biggest challenges of being a dad? Being a physician father, I guess, specifically, other than the time management, which we've touched on.
Yeah. You mentioned something I think is really helpful as a translator to why I think you can be a great dad, but also be a great physician. And I think one of those is going back to how you interact with people is really important. The intentionality of how you spend your time is not lost on anybody, right? Your kids especially. So, example, if you're at home and you spend the majority of your time at home thinking about what was happening or is happening at work, there's an intentionality to that. If you conversely are at home and you're interacting with your children and engaged in whatever activities that you're doing, there's an intentionality to that. And I think one way to get around, or at least to get to the point where people respect you as both a clinician and a good father, people in both locations, is to be very intentional with how you partition that time and your attention within those spaces. How do you do this well? I think, I hate to just say, oh, you got to communicate better, but the way in which you communicate your intentions is incredibly important. There's a big difference between saying, oh, I got to take a call for work, or saying, let's leave this for 10 minutes. I have to take care of something here and I will be back. And this is what we'll do. There's a difference in the way that sounds to the person you're interacting with.
Sure.
The other thing is that, there's time, my calendar is wide open to anybody who wants to look at it. So, in our house, we keep a family calendar. And so we know when my time is absolutely partitioned or relatively partitioned or not available. And, I try to, again, be very intentional about keeping up with that calendar.
No, I like that. And actually was listening to someone pretty recently, and they were basically described, this is Dr. Jimmy Turner, who has his own blog, basically describes intentional scheduling. But I think a lot of us, especially as physicians, and not that we value our life in this hierarchy, but just because of the way our time is often demanded, tend to schedule everything work related and fill in the family stuff. And to take a step back and be much more intentional and say, no, this is scheduling me, my family time, let work fill in the rest. And sometimes that's hard to do because of the expectations that are put on us, but it sounds like you kind of have your own approach to that, and it certainly is working well for you.
Yeah, the reality is, and I'm not saying that that's wrong, because for many people, that's absolutely the right way to do it.
Sure.
I'd make the argument that one of the things I do want my kids to understand is that I love work. It's a big part of my identity, and it's okay that I love work, and it's okay that I want to spend a lot of time doing work, and it's okay that I feel like there's a almost a nobility or a calling to the job that I have. And I want them to know that I value it that way. And there are times where it's a necessary sacrifice, I guess is not the right word, but you know what I mean? It's a necessary evil to be within that world and not be apologetic about it.
Mm.
And so I guess this is my roundabout way of saying that every family is a little bit different. And some families require you to be very intentional and put family first. Some families are going to be a little more adaptable, either because of the lifestyle of your wife or your kids, or by the way, the age of your kids is a big one.
Sure.
That you may need to be more present or intentional about your time with them prior to, your work schedule, and sometimes not. So, I tend to be somebody who treats the two a little bit more intertwined. There's not a lot of predictability necessarily from a week-to-week basis. I mean, for example, I'm in the ICU right now, but I also anticipate being home with my children. But I also recognize I might not be home with my children. And, I think you spoke to a lot of this. And I don't know that there's a perfect solution to just simply put one in front of the other, if that makes sense.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I know, and I want to thank you, I know you've spent a lot of time taking care of COVID patients, and I know the numbers have changed overall for the better in Baltimore. And I know you're not, an infectious disease doctor or a public health specialist, but you've certainly taken care of these patients. I guess, what message would you want out there regarding moving forward in our lives in the either COVID era or post-COVID era, depending who you asked? What would just sort of your overall life advice be?
Yeah, this one's tough. I think there's a lot of different perspectives to answer that from. I'll answer it from kind of the physician taking care of COVID patients first. My perspective on this is that, like anybody, when this first started out, it was the house is on fire and you don't think you run into the house. And that was necessary during that kind of initial surge.
Sure.
I will say that to continuously repeat that response is a little ridiculous at this point. And I think that if we aren't creating a systematic, maybe a little bit better overall response than to just simply say, there's an emergency in front of us, we need to just drop everything and take care of it, then I think we're not doing the right thing. So I would say that our overall slowness to adapt, I think, to the likelihood of this being a longer term issue than we've appreciated is a little halting. I'm a little surprised by it.
Sure.
As a father, somebody who takes care of these patients and goes home, I would say that I at no point felt like I had the option to opt out of taking care of COVID patients, despite the fact that I was going home to my family. There's a good and a bad to that. I think the bad is, of course, that you're inherently inviting risk.
Sure.
But I think the good to that is a little bit speaking to what I mentioned before. I want my children to understand that life requires something of you, that you have a calling in life to do something. And in some ways, this answers your question about whether or not I'd support them going into medicine or not. If this felt like a calling to one of them, and that was something that they felt like they needed to do, then that's something that should be supported. this is similar to how I feel like they should view this as me as a physician. I don't choose to want to be around in very scary infections and then come home and potentially infect my family, but it is a necessary part of the life that I've chosen, and I think it should be something that they should be exposed to, not the virus itself, but the reality that somebody is doing this and still living their lives. And then the last piece I'd say is that, COVID is just one more thing in the myriad of stuff that's going to hit our lives. And so, yes, it is the thing right now, but if 2020 hasn't taught us anything, it's that, golly, there's just going to be another thing that happens. And so in part, you got to embrace it and to whatever extent you can, try to enjoy it to be able to kind of move on to the next thing in life.
Sure. Well, I like that. Well, again, Dr. Grant, Mike, you've always been an incredible friend and mentor to me. I hope you know and appreciate that. I've done my best to make it clear to you because I mean it quite seriously. And I appreciate you chatting with me and my 3 listeners today.
So it's been my absolute pleasure. With your permission, I want to leave with one piece of advice to everybody. And I can't claim that this was my advice. Okay.
Absolutely.
So somebody said this to me one time and until then I hadn't thought about it, but I've done it every day since they've mentioned it to me. If you are a mom or a dad and you go home to your children, treat every time that you come home to your children like it's a big event. Make a big deal out of it. Swoop down, hug them, lose your mind, dance around with them, make it a big deal. And the reason that that's so important is because whatever it is that you were doing at work, they don't care about. And if you're wearing that when you're walking into the room, or you're feeling dog tired, or you just don't have the energy, none of that's going to make any difference to them. But what they're going to remember without question is you losing your mind when you get to see them at the end of the day. And I never thought about it until this person said this to me, and I've done it ever since. And it really is an event now. I mean, it's literally like I open the door and it's like Santa's walked into the house, and you can't replace that. And maybe it won't last when my 3 girls are in their teenage years. I don't think they're going to be losing their minds when I walk home, but for now it's pretty special, and I know they love it, and I personally have totally gotten into it. So that's my one small piece of advice to everybody.
I really like that. I think it's certainly some of our kids' nature to do that when we arrive, and I think it's easy to be too wrapped up mentally or otherwise in other things to not be more of an active participant in that celebration. And I think that's just missed opportunity for all of us. So I like that a lot. All right, man. Well, thank you so much for chatting with us, and I'll let you get back to your, I'm sure, very busy full ICU.
Thanks, man. Anytime. Thanks very much for the invite. Looking forward to the next one.
Absolutely.